Imagine a home that feels like a promise, a place where the scent of dinner in the oven lingers in the air, where laughter echoes through the rooms, where every corner holds a piece of you, your life, your dreams, your struggles. For James, Tasha, and their daughter Zoe, this apartment wasn't just four walls and a roof. It was the foundation of their future, built on years of hard work, love, and sacrifice. But like so many families before them, they were about to learn a harsh truth, that some people see the color of your skin before they see your humanity, and when that person holds the power to take everything away from you, no amount of love can protect you from the destruction they can bring. This apartment, these walls, they were more than just a place to live. They were the embodiment of their journey. James had spent countless nights fixing the small things that needed attention, each task a testament to his desire to provide. Tasha had poured herself into creating a home, making sure every room was filled with warmth. And Zoe, despite the trials of growing up, had come to think of this apartment as a sanctuary, a place where she could find herself, a place where her parents worked tirelessly to make sure she never had to fight for a seat at the table. But what happens when someone in a position of power decides that you don't belong? What happens when your very existence becomes a problem for someone whose sole purpose is to keep you out? For James, Tasha, and Zoe, the safety of their home was about to be ripped away by a man who never saw them as anything more than an inconvenience, a man who didn't believe they had the right to call this place their own. When Mr. Whitmore, the landlord, decided that he no longer wanted them in his building, he didn't just evict them. He erased their sense of security. He made them feel as though, despite all they had built, they were nothing more than interlopers, undeserving of the stability they had fought so hard for. No warning, no explanation, just a demand that they leave, because of who they were. And so, without warning, everything they had worked for came crashing down. No amount of pleading, no matter how many rights they invoked, could change the man's mind. He had already decided that they were not welcome, and there was nothing they could do about it. The legal loopholes were too small to crawl through, the systems too stacked against them. The words eviction echoed in the house, not just as a financial blow, but as a reminder of the system they were up against. How often did it take for people like Mr. Whitmore to feel entitled to take away something that didn't belong to them? How often did those in power forget that the people they treated as less than were the ones holding everything together? But what happens when that power gets challenged? What happens when someone refuses to let the weight of injustice crush them when they fight back, not just for themselves, but for every family that's ever been told they don't belong? When James, Tasha, and Zoe finally realize the full scope of Mr. Whitmore's actions, they don't just see a landlord with too much power. They see a symbol of everything wrong with how the world works. They see a man who's spent years exploiting people like them, making decisions based not on fairness, but on his bigoted views. But they also see something else. They see the chance to change it, to stand up, not just for themselves, but for anyone who has ever been silenced and been told they don't matter. And so begins the fight. They fight for their home, they fight for their dignity, and they fight for a future where they no longer have to live in fear of losing what's rightfully theirs. But in the end, what happens when one man's cruelty comes face to face with the truth? What happens when karma finally catches up with those who think they can play God? The answer? That's something Mr. Whitmore would soon find out. As the days passed, the weight of the eviction notice grew heavier, settling into the corners of their home like a dark cloud. James, determined to find a way out, sought the help of a lawyer hoping that the legal system might provide a shield, something to hold on to in the face of this unfair battle. Tasha, equally resolute, reached out to community organizations, searching for any ally who could help them navigate this treacherous path. Zoe, feeling the helplessness that so often accompanies injustice, turned to the internet, searching for answers about tenant rights, her screen filled with page after page of laws and regulations that seemed to offer little hope. The law, it seemed, had a language of its own, one that James could speak, one that made sense to him in the world of contracts and obligations. But even he knew that words on a page wouldn't change Mr. Whitmore's heart. The lawyer he spoke to was candid, offering no comfort in her words. Proving discrimination, she said, would be a long fight. They would need evidence. Proof of something that, in a world built on privilege, was almost impossible to capture. As James sat in that lawyer's office, the reality began to sink in. This wasn't just about a lease. This wasn't just about an eviction. This was a fight against something far bigger, something ingrained in the very systems that were supposed to protect people like them. It wasn't just about their home, it was about their place in the world, and whether or not they even had the right to exist in peace. Back at the apartment, the situation continued to deteriorate. Mr. Whitmore, emboldened by his perceived power, escalated his actions. He sent unnecessary fines, using the smallest infractions to make their lives even harder. He threatened to sell the building, knowing full well that doing so would leave them with nothing, no home, no safety net. The lies he spread about them to other tenants took root, poisoning the very community they had called home. He told others that they were nothing but trouble, that they didn't belong, that the building would be better off without them. The family found themselves pushed to the edge, unable to find a new place to live. Caught in the web of a housing market that seemed to reject them at every turn, they were forced to pack up their lives, one box at a time. James and Tasha, once partners in everything, began to argue, the strain of their situation threatening to tear them apart. Zoe, once bright-eyed and hopeful, saw her grades slip, the weight of her family's struggle pulling her down. The emotional toll began to show, their home no longer a sanctuary but a battleground. But even as the stress mounted, something began to shift. In the face of this relentless assault, the family began to find support in unexpected places. They reached out to local activist groups, organizations that had fought for tenants' rights for years, groups that understood the cruel realities of housing discrimination. The activists, moved by the family story, rallied behind them, offering advice, resources, and a sense of solidarity they had desperately needed. Together, they began to gather evidence, talking to others who had lived in the building, uncovering a history of Mr. Whitmore's discriminatory actions, a pattern that was hard to ignore. Tasha and James began to visit former tenants, people who had been evicted under similar circumstances, people who had been silenced by Mr. Whitmore's power and privilege, and with each visit they uncovered more, tenants of color who had been driven out for no reason other than their skin color, a trail of injustice that Mr. Whitmore had left behind like footprints in the sand. These tenants spoke in quiet tones, their anger masked by years of hurt. But the truth was there, in their eyes, in their words. It was clear this was no isolated incident. Mr. Whitmore had made a habit of using his position to push out anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of what his building should look like. As they listened, Tasha's anger began to swell, but it was a wave of anger tempered by something else, something sharper, something that burned with the promise of change. She couldn't let this go, not this time, not when she had a family to protect, not when she had the strength to fight. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about ensuring that Mr. Whitmore couldn't do this to anyone else, and that his actions would no longer go unchecked. And so, they began to gather the evidence they needed piece by piece, ready to take the fight to a place where Mr. Whitmore's power no longer held sway. The road ahead was long, and it would not be easy, but for the first time in a long while there was a sense of hope, a hope that came not from the system, but from the community, from the people who understood the fight for what it truly was. In the days following the discovery of Mr. Whitmore's dark history, a shift began. The family, now armed with the truth, gathered their evidence and made their first major step, filing a lawsuit against him. What had started as a battle for a home had now transformed into a fight for justice. This wasn't just about reclaiming a place to live. This was about exposing a system that allowed someone like Whitmore to wield so much unchecked power. The lawsuit didn't just land on a few desks, it made waves. What had been a small personal conflict quickly grew into something much larger. As the story of their fight gained traction, the media jumped on the story, amplifying their voices and bringing attention to the years of discrimination Mr. Whitmore had been hiding. Interviews, news segments, and investigative reports began revealing the ugly truth. Whitmore wasn't just a landlord with one bad decision. He was part of a larger systemic problem, a man who had used his position to push out countless tenants of color, and all with impunity. The family, once cornered and voiceless, now stood at the center of a storm, and in that storm they found strength. And for the first time, it wasn't just about their battle. It was about the millions of others who had been pushed down by people like Whitmore. Their voices, their struggle, now had a chance to be heard. But as the family fought on, Mr. Whitmore's empire, the one he had so carefully built on lies and intimidation, began to crumble. The tenants who had once remained silent, too afraid to speak out, now stood with the family, their boycott gaining momentum. They refused to pay rent. They refused to stay silent any longer. The community, once divided, now rallied against Whitmore, the truth too loud to ignore. Mr. Whitmore, desperate to salvage his reputation, tried to maintain the illusion of control. He made frantic calls to his lawyer, hoping for a way out, but the walls were closing in. On one call, his frustration boiled over as he raged into the phone. "This can't be happening. I didn't do anything wrong." But the truth was clear. His actions were being scrutinized, his name being dragged through the media. His history of discrimination, once hidden behind closed doors, was now exposed for the world to see. Reporters spoke to former tenants, to activists, to lawyers, and all the pieces fell into place. The laws were on the side of the people now. Whitmore's discriminatory practices, once brushed aside, were now front and center in the public eye. And the law, as it always does, began to take its course. Legal consequences loomed, and the once untouchable landlord was forced to sell off his buildings. The tenants, who had once feared him, now stood triumphant. They had won, but so had everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that had allowed people like Whitmore to thrive. His empire was in ruins, and he was left to reckon with the consequences of his actions. The family, after months of struggle, finally saw the light at the end of the tunnel. The court case ended in their favor, and with the settlement money, they did what many thought was impossible. They bought a home of their own, a place where no one could take it from them, where they could finally breathe without the constant fear of eviction hanging over them. The new house wasn't just a roof over their heads. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for. their dignity, their rights, and their family's future. It was a new beginning, a chance to build something lasting, something real. Zoe, with a smile on her face that hadn't been there in months, turned to her parents as they stood together on the porch of their new home. Her voice was full of hope, full of the promise of something better. You said we could have a yard one day. I didn't think it would be this soon. Tasha, her eyes glistening with tears, looked at Zoe and then at James, her hand in his, the weight of everything they had been through heavy in the air. But at that moment, she knew they had made it. She knew they had won. And she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "We fought for this. This is our home." James, standing tall beside her, looked at the new house with pride and determination. His voice was steady as he spoke, but the truth was clear. No one would take this from them. And no one can take it away from us. In the face of hate, they had found strength. In the face of adversity, they had found a place to call their own. And Mr. Whitmore? Karma had found him first. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it comes, it is relentless. Mr. Whitmore's empire may have collapsed, but the family's new home stood as a testament to everything they had overcome. A home where they could finally be free, a home where, for the first time in years, they could truly live. As the days passed, the weight of the battle slowly lifted from the shoulders of James, Tasha, and Zoe. The fight had been long, exhausting, but it had brought them to a place they never thought possible, a place where they could finally breathe. In the quiet of their new home, they found peace. The house, once just a dream, was now a reality, and in that reality, they had everything they had fought for. The sounds of the day, laughter, conversations, the clink of silverware filled the house, echoing through rooms that were once empty and cold. The family sat together at the dinner table, the warmth of the meal and each other's presence reminding them of what they had gained. There was no fear here, no whispers of eviction, no landlord to intimidate them, just the sound of family, of home, a place where they were free to live, to thrive, and to dream. James looked around the table, his eyes softening as he saw his daughter smiling, her worries from the past seeming to melt away with each passing day. Tasha's face was lit with pride, a reflection of all she had endured and all they had achieved together. Ah, Zoe, her once worried eyes now bright with hope, laughed along with her parents, the sound filling the space around them like music. This was their home now. This was where their lives would continue to unfold. Sometimes justice takes time. It moves in ways that we can't always understand, through paths we might never see. But in the end, it always comes for those who think they're untouchable, those who think their actions will never have consequences. This family's fight wasn't just about a home. It wasn't just about reclaiming a space to live. No, their fight was something bigger. It was about standing up to the wrongs of the past. It was about showing that when you stand together, when you refuse to be silenced, even the most powerful can be brought to their knees. And perhaps, most importantly, it was about ensuring a future where fairness is not a privilege but a right for everyone. In the end, they not only found a home, they found their voice, their power, and their place in a world that too often tries to silence people like them. They built a future, and that future, in their hands, was something no one could take away from them. Their journey wasn't just theirs alone. It was a journey for everyone who had been wronged, for everyone who had been told they didn't belong, for all those who had been shut out, ignored, and discarded. This fight was for them. As the family sat together in their new home, In the light of everything they had fought for, they knew one thing. They had changed the world, just a little bit, for the better. Sometimes it's not about the home you build, it's about the future you fight for.